Japan has an unusual number of businesses that are several hundred years old and a handful that are past 1,000. The oldest of them was a temple building firm founded in the late 6th century. It was constructing wooden buildings before England existed as a country, before paper reached Europe, before almost anything you could name as a historical landmark. It kept going in the same trade for roughly 1,400 years. The obvious question is how? And the answer, when you look at what those businesses actually did, is that most of them did the opposite of what a modern company is told to do. Deliberately, for centuries, as policy, I spent 4 years in Japan learning a trade in a small workshop that was not 1,000 years old, but was old enough that nobody could tell me when it started. Some of what follows I saw directly, some of it I learned afterwards from people who study these firms for a living. Today, I want to go through 9 things they have in common, not as a business school lesson. I am not qualified to give you one, but because the pattern is genuinely strange and it inverts almost every instinct a modern founder has. And I am going to end honestly because the story has a hard edge to it. That 1,400-year-old firm was absorbed by a larger company in 2006 after a debt problem. Longevity is not the same as success. Several of these businesses survive on circumstances that no longer exist, and I would rather tell you that than sell you a fable. Stay to number 9. It is the one that explains the other 8, and it is the one nobody wants to hear. Number 1. They refused to get bigger. The clearest common feature is a deliberate cap on size, usually at whatever a family and a small number of employees can run directly, not a failure to grow. A refusal. The reasoning is easy to state and very hard to act on. Growth requires capital. Capital requires either debt or outside owners. Both of those introduce people whose time horizon is shorter than yours. A lender wants repayment on a schedule. An investor wants a return within their own working life. And a business that has taken on either has, in effect, agreed to be run at somebody else's tempo. A firm that stays small enough to fund itself out of its own trade answers to nobody and can therefore make a decision whose payoff is 40 years away. That is the whole trick, and it is unavailable to almost every business that has ever raised money. There is a second reason for the cap that has nothing to do with money, and it took me a while to see it. A business run directly by the people who own it can hold its standards in their heads. Nobody has to write down what good enough means, because the person deciding is the person doing, and they simply know. Past a certain size, that stops working. You now need written standards, inspection, training, a quality system, all of which are attempts to reproduce in documents something that used to live in one person's judgment. They work, more or less, and they are never as good, and they consume an enormous amount of the organization's attention. Staying under that threshold is not modesty. It is refusing to convert tacit knowledge into paperwork, because the conversion is lossy and the loss is permanent. My teacher had never written down a single specification in his life. He also would not have been able to run a workshop of 40 people, and he knew that, and he had no intention of trying. Do this. Whatever you run, work out the largest size you could operate without borrowing. That number is worth knowing even if you decide to exceed it. Number 2. One thing. Held for centuries. They make one product or perform one service, and they continue to do so while everything around them changes. Soy sauce, sweets, inns, temple carpentry, brushes, paper. The instinct in a modern business is to diversify. If the core is doing well, extend into adjacent things because concentration is risk, and over a 5-year horizon that is correct. Over a 300-year horizon, the calculation reverses because the thing that kills old firms is almost never the core business becoming unprofitable. It is an adjacent venture going wrong and taking the healthy core down with it. Concentration is risky in the short run and protective in the long one. There is a second effect. A firm that has done one thing for 8 generations accumulates knowledge that genuinely cannot be bought or copied quickly, and that becomes the reason customers keep coming. There is a consequence of holding one thing that only appears across generations, and it is about who your customers are. A firm doing one thing for 300 years is not selling to a market. It is selling to a chain of people whose parents and grandparents bought from the same place. The relationship is inherited on both sides at once, and a customer who inherited you is an extraordinarily durable thing to have. Diversify, and each new line starts from 0 on that dimension. It may sell perfectly well. It will not be inherited because nobody's grandmother bought it. That is the quiet reason concentration compounds. You are not only accumulating skill in the product, you are accumulating a customer base that renews itself without marketing, and that renewal only happens along the line you have actually held. Do this. Name the one thing your organization is actually for. If it takes more than a sentence, that is the finding. Number 3. Succession is arranged decades early and not necessarily by blood. This is the strangest one, and the one I would most want you to know about. These firms plan succession a generation ahead, and when the bloodline does not produce a suitable successor, no children or children with no aptitude or no interest, the standard solution is to adopt one, not a child, an adult, frequently a promising employee or a son-in-law, legally adopted into the family as an heir, taking the family name and the business with it. Japan has one of the highest rates of adult adoption in the world, and this is a large part of why. Look at what that solves. The single greatest threat to a family business anywhere is the incompetent heir, the generation that inherits something it cannot run. Most cultures treat that as bad luck. This arrangement treats the family as a role to be filled rather than a genetic fact, and simply appoints the best available person into it. It is, in a strict sense, a merit system wearing the clothes of a hereditary one. There is a detail in the timing that makes this work, and it is the part most family businesses get wrong everywhere in the world. The successor is identified decades early and then trained inside the business for those decades, not announced at the end, chosen at the beginning and then given 20 or 30 years to become capable in the specific, unwritten way that the job requires. Compare the usual pattern where succession becomes a live question in the founder's final years, at which point the available options are whoever happens to be standing nearby and whoever can be hired quickly. Both are worse than somebody who has been learning the work since they were 20. The uncomfortable implication is that succession is not a decision you make at the end of a career. It is a decision you make in the middle of one, when you would much rather be doing the work, and when naming anybody feels premature. Almost nobody does it at that point, and that is why almost nobody has a good answer later. Do this. If you run anything, name your successor now, in your own head, and be honest about whether you chose them for capability or for proximity. Then work out what they would need 20 years to learn. Number 4. The supplier relationship outlasts the people in it. Old firms tend to buy buy from other old firms, and those arrangements run for generations. The modern approach is to tender regularly, keep suppliers competing, and switch when somebody offers better terms. That extracts a lower price, and it is entirely rational within a normal planning horizon. What it cannot produce is a supplier who will carry you through a bad year, hold a scarce material for you when everyone wants it, or tell you honestly that what you have asked for is a mistake. Those behaviors only appear in a relationship that both sides expect to outlive them, and they are worth a great deal more than the few percent that competitive tendering saves, but only on a timescale most companies never plan across. There is a version of this that runs in the other direction, and it is the half people forget. The supplier is also betting on you. A workshop that has supplied the same firm for 4 generations has organized its own capacity, its own training, and sometimes its own premises around that relationship continuing. If you switch, you do not simply save a few percent, you may end a business. That is a real obligation, and the old firms treat it as one. It also explains a behavior that looks irrational from the outside, continuing to buy from somebody who has become slightly more expensive, because ending them would be a larger cost than the difference, just not a cost that appears on your accounts. Which is the general shape of the thing. Long relationships move costs off your books and onto a shared account that neither party is measuring. Short ones do the opposite and look more efficient precisely because the costs land somewhere you are not looking. Do this. Identify the 2 relationships your organization genuinely could not replace this year. Then work out which of your suppliers could not replace you. Number 5. The rule about debt. The common position among these firms is close to a refusal to borrow at all, or to borrow only against something they could lose without ending. This sounds like conservatism, and it is closer to arithmetic about survival. A business without debt can have a terrible year. Sales collapse, the family eats less, the workshop runs quiet, and the firm continues, because nobody is owed anything on a fixed date. A business with debt cannot have a terrible year, because the payment is due regardless of whether anybody came through the door. Across 300 years, a firm will encounter wars, famines, fires, epidemics, and depressions. It is not a question of whether the terrible year arrives. It is a question of how many. Debt converts a survivable event into a fatal one and does so repeatedly. And here is the part that connects to the ending of this video. The 1400-year-old firm I mentioned did eventually take on substantial debt during a construction boom, and that is what finished it. There is a distinction worth drawing, because a blanket refusal to borrow is not what most of these firms actually practiced. The rule was closer to this: never borrow against the thing you cannot afford to lose. A loan secured on a spare plot of land is a bet you can lose and continue. A loan secured on the workshop is a bet that ends the business if it goes wrong, and no expected return justifies putting the 14th generation on the table. That sounds obvious, stated plainly, and it is broken constantly, usually during good years, because during good years, the downside feels theoretical. The other half of the rule is about the timing of obligations rather than their size. Debt is dangerous less because of the amount than because the payment arrives on a fixed date regardless of what is happening that month. A business with lumpy income and fixed obligations is fragile even when the numbers look comfortable on an annual average. Do this. Ask what your organization would do if income halved for 18 months. If the answer involves a payment, you cannot pause. That is your actual risk. Number 6. Profit is reinvested rather than extracted. The surplus goes back into the building, the tools, the training, and a reserve, rather than out to owners. That is straightforward when the owners are also the people doing the work and expect their grandchildren to inherit it. It becomes almost impossible when ownership and operation are separated because an owner who is not present has no use for a well-maintained roof in 2070. The reserve is the part that matters most. Several of these firms are described as holding cash equivalent to years of operating costs, which any modern analyst would call inefficient. That money is idle. It could be working, and it is idle, right up until the year a war closes the roads, and then it is the only reason there is still a business afterwards. Efficiency and survival are different objectives, and they pull in opposite directions. Almost all modern management advice optimizes the first. There is a way of thinking about the reserve that makes it easier to defend, because in a normal year it looks indefensible. It is not savings, it is insurance. You are underwriting yourself. Nobody argues that an insurance premium is idle money, even though it produces nothing in a year when the roof does not fall in. The reserve does exactly the same job for the events no policy covers: a market disappearing, a supply chain closing, 3 quiet years, and it costs you the return you would have made on that capital. That framing matters because a reserve is under permanent attack. Every year, somebody can point at it and describe a better use, and every one of those arguments is correct in isolation. The only defense is having decided in advance what the money is for and refusing to reopen the question annually. The firms that lasted are the ones that treated the reserve as untouchable rather than as a balance. That is not financial sophistication. It is a rule made once by somebody who is now dead and honored since. Do this. Work out how many months your organization could operate on what it holds. Most people find the number is much smaller than they assumed. Number 7. The method changes constantly. The purpose does not. This is where the popular story about these firms is usually wrong. They are not museums. A soy sauce house that has operated for 4 centuries has changed its equipment, its packaging, its distribution, its energy source, and its record-keeping many times. Some of them use modern industrial processes now. What has not changed is what they are for. The distinction is between the method and the purpose, and old firms are ruthless about the first and immovable about the second. Anything that makes the same product better or more reliably is adopted. Anything that changes what the product is gets refused, even when it is obviously profitable. That is a much more demanding discipline than either pure tradition or pure adaptation, and it is why most attempts to imitate this fail. People copy the old equipment, which is the part that was never sacred. There is a test for which column something belongs in, and it is more useful than any amount of debate about heritage. Ask what the customer would notice. If a change is invisible to the person receiving the work, a different kiln, a different ledger system, a different way of moving material around the yard, it is method, and defending it is nostalgia wearing a work apron. If a change alters what the person actually receives, it is purpose, and the fact that it would be cheaper or faster is not an argument. The failure mode runs both ways, and both are common. Firms that defend their methods die slowly of inefficiency while insisting they are protecting tradition. Firms that let purpose drift become successful for about 15 years and then discover that nobody can say what they are for anymore, including the people who work there. The old ones seem to have got this right mostly by having so few things in the purpose column. When there are 2, you can hold them. When there are 9, you will lose most of them without noticing. Do this. List the things about your work that are method and the things that are purpose. Then check whether you have been defending the wrong column. Number 8. They stay where they are. Old firms are overwhelmingly local. They serve a place, they are known in that place, and they generally do not expand into other regions, even when the product would sell. Part of that is the size cap from number 1. Part of it is that a reputation built over generations is not portable. It exists in the specific relationships of one town, and a branch in another city starts at 0 while diluting the attention of the people who made the original work good. There is also something less comfortable. Staying local means accepting a hard ceiling on how large the business can ever be. These firms are not big. Most of them are tiny by modern standards, and the trade they made was explicitly duration over scale. There is a specific advantage to staying put that only shows up over a long enough period, and it is about information. A firm that has served one town for 200 years knows things about that town that no research can produce. Which families are connected to which? What sold badly in the bad years and why? Which supplier's grandfather was reliable and which was not? That knowledge is not written anywhere, and it is not transferable, and it is a genuine competitive position that a larger, newer competitor simply cannot buy. The moment you open in a second city, none of it applies. You are a newcomer there, competing against somebody who has the local version of what you have at home. And you are now dividing your attention between 2 places, in one of which you are the weaker party. That is the trade that looks like timidity from outside and is closer to knowing precisely where your advantage lives. Do this. Be honest about which you are optimizing for. Both are legitimate. Pretending you are doing both is how organizations end up doing neither. Number 9. Longevity is not success, and I promise to say so. Here is the honest ending. That 1400-year-old firm no longer exists independently. It took on debt during a boom. The boom ended, and in 2006, it was absorbed by a construction company. 14 centuries ended by a fairly ordinary financial mistake. And a good deal of the survival of the others is circumstantial rather than admirable. Japan's long period of closure to the outside world, unusual inheritance customs, a domestic market that stayed stable for centuries, and cultural weight attached to continuing a family line. Those conditions produced these firms, and they are not conditions anybody can recreate on purpose. There is also a selection effect that people forget. We are looking at the ones that lasted. We do not have a list of the tens of thousands of family workshops that followed exactly the same principles and were destroyed by a fire, a war, a bad harvest, or a childless generation. Their strategy is invisible because there is nobody left to describe it. So, do not conclude that these 9 practices cause survival. What you can conclude is narrower and still useful. that a business optimized for duration looks radically different from one optimized for growth, and that almost every piece of advice you will receive assumes the second without ever telling you it has chosen. If what you want is to hand something to somebody in 40 years, most of the standard advice is not for you, and these 9 things are a description of the alternative. There is one more thing worth saying about that selection problem, because it applies well beyond this subject. Almost every lesson anybody draws from history is drawn from survivors, and survivors are not a random sample. We study the firms that lasted, the companies that succeeded, the people who made it, and we cannot study the ones who did exactly the same things and were unlucky because there is no record of them and nobody wrote a book. Which means the honest version of any lesson like this is conditional. These practices are what long-lived firms had in common, whether they caused the longevity or merely accompanied it, or were simply what small, careful businesses did in that place and time, is a question the available evidence cannot settle. I find that more useful than a confident answer because it tells you how much weight to put on it. Enough to think with, not enough to bet a business on because a video said so. Do this. Decide which of the 2 you are building. Then take advice from people building the same thing and discount all of it, including this. So, 9 things. A deliberate cap on size. 1 product held. Succession arranged early by capability rather than blood. Supplier relationships that outlast the people. Near refusal of debt. Reinvestment and a large reserve. Method changed freely. Purpose never. Local rather than expanded. And the honest admission that none of it guarantees anything. I keep coming back to number 3 because it is the one that could not be more foreign to how the West thinks about family firms and is obviously, once you see it, the correct answer. The problem every family business has is that the next generation is a lottery. These firms simply refused to play the lottery. If the child was right, the child inherited. If not, somebody else became the child. That is either the most ruthless thing in this video or the most humane, depending on how you look at it. And I have never quite settled which. Now, tell me the number. Out of those 9, which one would be hardest for the place you work? Just the number in the comments. I would guess 1 because refusing to grow is the single most heretical idea in modern business and almost nobody is allowed to say it out loud. And if this landed, send it to whoever you know who is about to take on funding to grow faster. Next time, I am going to show you the 12 things that make being on time in Japan a property of the system rather than a personality trait. Until then, work out whether you are building for growth or for duration and stop taking advice meant for the other one.